I am very angry and not at all hesitant to call out the leadership and the powerful people in the movement of American evangelicalism, in politics, but I'm very hesitant to bring that down to everyday people.
Well, welcome to God is Better Than You Think. My name is Joshua Pease. This is a YouTube channel where I interview people within Christianity who may not have mainstream voices, but should. These are people who are talking about things within Christianity that I think are interesting and fascinating and important and often ignored. And this is a chance to give them space to talk about why they believe God is better than he is often painted to be by a lot of mainstream Christianity. This is a podcast both for people within Christianity who feel frustrated by the lack of these conversations, but it's also very much for people who are struggling or who are looking for faith or who have frustrations with Christianity in America and yet find themselves still captivated by Jesus. We have a lot of really great interviews coming up. We have an interview with someone who works specifically with trying to help women find a better and more positive view of sex within Christianity. We have someone who's going to be talking about his journey of going from being sort of an evangelical darling to someone who started asking a lot of questions and it cost him a lot. We are going to be interviewing someone who's going to be talking about a theology of how Christians should engage in the political arena. We have a lot of good stuff coming up. So please subscribe to this channel so that you get updates when all that stuff happens, because we have a lot more exciting stuff coming up. Today's guest is Angela Denker. Angela is both a pastor and a journalist. She is someone who is really inserting herself in between the liberal and conservative worlds. She's probably personally more liberal in a lot of ways, and at the same time is trying to do the work of reconciling the body of Christ to where we're not divided by these red state, blue state lines. And she has a lot of really powerful things to say about our job as Christians in navigating a very divided time and culture. This is absolutely something worth checking out. So please watch and enjoy this interview with Angela Denker.
Yes, no, same. Hopefully my background looks okay in here. I haven't done like a video thing in a little while. I've done so many audio things, so I'm like, oh crap. I should change.
Yeah. It's like quarantine life and doing Skype interviews don't necessarily go hand in hand. So I'm making you up your game today, you know? No, I mean, I'm in an apartment and I guess I cleared off the clothes that were back there, but there were clothes back there not that long ago. My wife has insisted that I do that, so.
Yeah, no, that's good. What is the black and red book up there?
That's a good question. It's a John Maxwell book.
Okay, it looked like a Kierkegaard, like Fear and Trembling
book that I have. No, you've desperately overestimated my reading. But, however.
All right.
So for those people who don't know, this is Angela Denker, and she's the best. And she wrote a book that I was just showing up on the screen called Red State Christians. And just there's so many things that we're going to get into. I'm so excited to get into all of them. Something I learned about you that I didn't know. You, at one point in time, planned on being the first female Major League Baseball player.
A long, unrealized dream, unfortunately.
I mean, there's still time, right? We don't have to give up on it just yet.
That's right. I better keep practicing my swing.
Okay, so for people who have no idea who you are or why we're talking, can you just, I'm sure I'll add like a quick little bio thing to the front of this, but I would love for them to hear from you. Who are you? What do you do? What are you passionate about? Yeah,
so I am a journalist and a pastor, and a former sports writer who still, as you kind of alluded to, has a heart for sports in the ways that the stories of sports can illuminate larger truths about our lives, whether those are truths about God or about our country. So that tends to be a lot of the writing that I do, about sports, about social issues. And I like to find unexpected connections between things that seem disparate, And perhaps that's
Mm.
because I'm a Lutheran and I love paradoxical theology and things that don't seem to make sense.
So did you
That's
find
my
Lutheranism, or did Lutheranism find you?
I think I was born into it, sort of, in the weird way that that works. But my grandfather was a rural Lutheran pastor in Nebraska and in Kansas, in northern Minnesota. And his grandfather was a German missionary who came to Canada. So it kind of
So
skips
this
a
is
generation.
it's kind of in your blood then.
A little bit. My father's family is Catholic, so it's a mix.
But like, okay, so tell like, in addition to being a journalist and a writer, you mentioned that you're a pastor as well. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's and I don't know how much we'll talk about this too, but
We
I
talk
think
about all the things, Angela.
the reason that I first connected with you, Josh, is because I so appreciate, your writing and your vision for what women's lives have been like in the
Mhm.
church. And so I'm always aware of sort of there's this duality about even saying that I'm a pastor, because
Mhm.
for some people they're like, oh, that's awesome. And some people are like, all right, I'm done. I'm going to stop reading now. Just because it's
Mhm.
such a loaded thing for some people to have women be a part of ministry.
For you
Um,
to exist. For
yeah,
some people, your existence is problematic, right?
yeah, yeah. It's
It's just super
interesting.
fun for you.
Yeah. So, but I began my career as a journalist and then went to seminary in 2009. And I've served churches in Chicago, Las Vegas, Orange County, California, which I think we have a similarity there.
Do.
And then I'm currently serving a congregation made up mostly of farmers and factory workers in southwestern Minnesota. So,
Sure. Sure. The next natural step up the ministry line, I think, right?
yes, yes, totally.
Can I ask you what church you were at in Orange County? I mean, we don't have to talk about it since this is being
Yes,
recorded and all that, but
yeah.
I'm curious.
So Lutheran Church, I was at Messiah Lutheran Church in
Okay.
Yorba Linda. So
Okay. Got it. Yeah, I think we talked about this at one point. Yeah, I was at Saddleback Church for a while and
yes,
did the whole mega church Orange County thing for a little bit. That
yes,
I think that's part of the reason why I'm this is gonna probably make you feel awkward. I feel like you are a more healthy, humble version of me
oh,
because you've experienced so many different things and you've like lived in so many different areas, and I have as well, except I
right.
turned into this polarizing firebrand who has a hard time showing grace. And I feel like, Angela, what has been so remarkable about your work. So when I read your book, I noticed this and everything I've seen from you before and since, you have such a passion. It seems to me, it's like you and I probably on a lot of things feel very similarly in terms of discontents, things we're frustrated with in the church, things that we just have, we find inexcusable. And
Right.
yet at the same time, there's such a graciousness that you have shown and how you have written about things and where you have really genuinely tried to find the value or the humanity in all these different cultures. Why is that? What is it in you that created that longing and that desire for that?
Um, I mean, I think that I guess I'll answer it two different ways. The first way that I see it is, maybe my pastoral answer or whatever. But I really believe that is, and I don't live up to this, but that's
Yeah.
the example that Jesus called us into when God was frustrated with human beings and then
Mhm.
decided, okay, instead of, killing them all, I'm going to lower myself to live as a human being. And Jesus was just uncompromising in that he would not allow anybody's humanity to be diminished. Anybody. And so that is a huge guiding principle that I want to work on. Is just that value of the humanity in each person, and that I think doesn't discount the broader social movements that I very much am a part of and want to be a part of. But in moving towards those social movements, the value of each person's humanity is something that I really want to hold on to as well.
Because we've lost that. I mean, it's not like losing. It feels like lost, like it's gone. And I'll be honest, I'm part of that. I think this is something that God has been convicting me a lot about lately, and it's something we'll talk about a lot along the way. But
Mm-hmm.
I do you feel overwhelmed If that's your burden in your mission, do you feel overwhelmed by the lack of civility, the lack of seeing that like Imago Dei stamped in people, that like just a loss of that value?
I think that in reality, it's really been eroded for a very long time. Like so many things, we can only see the tip of the iceberg, and really it's been there a long time. So
Mm.
I think that this erosion I mean, as Americans, because so much of my work is really looking at how this manifests itself for us as American citizens.
Right.
That this inability to view each person's humanity as being important is rooted in our Constitution.
Ooh, okay, let's get into it. I'm in. You just stepped right into Josh's lane of interest. Explain that.
Yeah, so I think that, the fact that a broader set of white Americans is beginning to come to terms with that, I think, again, in sort of a paradoxical way, even though it feels so hopeless, it also makes me feel like my journalism side says that once all this ugliness is out in the open, ultimately that death is going to lead into some kind of new resurrection. So that's what I try to hold on to. But I've ebbed and flowed at different points since writing Red State Christians about thinking, if I back in the day when we used to do events and I would do readings for people.
Remember that? Remember
Yeah.
when we used to see each other and do things? That was fun. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, I would ask myself, like, I'd be reading these lines from my conclusion that would sound like hopeful, and I would be like, do I? And I think I have a line in there that talks about like building a Democratic Party of the future. And I remember reading that line shortly after Joe Biden became the nominee, and I was like, oh, this isn't what we anticipated.
No.
So I don't know, but
Yeah, apparently our lesson from 2016 was like, let's just kind of repeat the same thing, I guess. Like, apparently
yeah,
we didn't really learn much.
get the woman out of there. No women allowed.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I am hopeful, and it's because of individuals that I'm hopeful. And so whenever I start to feel like that, I look back at the individuals in my book who gave me hope, who were living in situations that seemed that like they could be really hopeless. And so that's, what gives me hope too.
Is that part of why you find yourself in kind of this? So you're a pastor, you're in sort of a smaller rural community, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of the joy of that for you, is like being able to hold on to the simplicity of just doing and being the church?
Yeah, until COVID hit.
Sure.
But no,
Yeah.
it is. I mean, and I think we were writing about this a little bit. So I still live in Minneapolis. I serve part-time, which is, as a pastor, what does that really mean? But I go out there a few days a week to Broughton. It's about an hour drive. And that was part of my desire after my book came out in August. I had been serving a teaching pastor role in a really large multi-site congregation here in the Twin Cities. And I ended that role in May, and then my book came out in August of last year. And I was trying to figure out, okay, what is this life going to look like for me? And I really had this desire to be in the local church like you, and to find, and not just because I didn't want to waste my ordination, but because, I wanted those routines of like baptizing and presiding over communion and meeting with people to talk about their relationships and their families and planning funerals. So yeah, even throughout COVID, it has been really grounding to be a part of this church community. And it's been a really interesting experience to be, for instance, during this sort of racial reawakening that we've had, unfortunately, after the murder of George Floyd, which took place 4 miles from my house right here. It's been really interesting to be, sort of trying to be a part of this anti-racism movement here in the city, in my urban neighborhood, which I live in a very white corner of Minneapolis, I'll be honest. But working on being a part of that, and then at the same time driving out to a rural community and seeing how they're perceiving what's happening with George Floyd, what's happening in Minneapolis, and getting the opportunity to say, like, yes, this is what we saw on CNN or on Fox News of what's happening in Minneapolis, but I'm your pastor. I live there. This is what I experienced. And, you know, a lot of people in my church, it's not like they're isolated. They're driving in. One guy's a crane operator. He's driving in every day to work in the city. And other guys are coming in and out. But it's been really important to have both of those two experiences, again, with my love of opposites and things that don't seem like they should go together. It's been really great for me. And I've never wanted to live in a homogeneous world, you know, where everybody thinks the same way. So it's been really, and that was a big battle with my book too. And I don't know what you think about that with your writing. But I felt pressure when, you know, talking about covering Christians who voted for Trump.
Yep.
I feel like my publisher and my editor, a lot of people saw this as like, well, this is going to be a book for liberal elites to understand. And I never, ever saw it that way. And I fought really hard to make sure that this would be a book that people who live in rural areas, people who are conservative, you know, would read this book and be able to get something out of it. And I think there's a lot of pressure to declare, like, this is a conservative book. This is a conservative church. This is a liberal book. This is a liberal church. And I've been really resistant about that, without saying that, you know, we're not going to call out the evils of the administration and what's happening right now in American Christianity. But
so why have you been resistant?
Because I am really worried about Christian nationalism, right? And we've seen the ways that this desire for the church to be powerful and to be wealthy, and as you experienced and I experienced in Orange County, working at churches that have multi-million-dollar budgets and mortgages that are several tens of thousands of dollars a month, that comes with it a lot of times a compromise in the church's values, and it becomes very easy to slip into idolatry. So I would collapse Christian nationalism into idolatry. And I think that the tendency as a reaction to right-wing Christian nationalism for a lot of people who are liberal is to say, okay, well, we need to really embrace the opposite, and we really need to embrace the Democratic Party and its causes. And in a lot of times we do need to lift up welcome to LGBTQ people into the church. We do need to talk about why pro-life is not an abortion issue, but a much broader issue for Christians. But I have seen, as part of reaction, you don't want to slide then into making the Democratic Party your idol. And I even felt like that was a corrective for me in 2016 of 8 years of President Obama. It was just 2016 was a reminder for me that no matter who's in office, the church necessarily cannot be overly aligned with power.
So that's really fascinating. And that's why I kind of said I feel like as though you're in some ways a better version of me, because I feel like that, like, I know that's true, and yet I find myself not so much maybe like attaching to the Democratic Party. It's for me not demonizing a group of people or a side that I'm deeply frustrated with. How do you find yourself, and maybe part of it's just like your life where you're going from Minneapolis to this rural church and you're living in both. How do you find yourself not becoming someone who starts seeing one group, one side as like the enemy?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's complicated, but I just really think too that the enemy of people who want to follow Jesus is power, and a lot of times, and power that is, you know, aligned with something other than bringing glory to God and, you know, creating a world in which each person has the right to life and the right to freedom. So I just think that I am very angry and not at all hesitant to call out the leadership and the powerful people in the movement of American evangelicalism in politics, but I'm very hesitant to bring that down to everyday people who I feel like have, I don't know, I don't want to say victimized or manipulated, because I don't think that's always true. But I just would much rather focus my energies on the people who are aligned with power in the church.
Struggle at the same time with, what do you do when the fact that from our point of view, the president, the party that's being supported by 81% of white evangelicals is actively hurting people? How do you balance like feeling like, no, there is a moral responsibility here, while at the same time not like turning that into this person's like a caricature?
Yeah. I'm traveling to Kansas City next week too. So
okay. Maybe you'll have a good experience too.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And I think that's part of it too. That, I know that for me, whenever I'm talking about Christians who voted for Trump, I am not talking about a demographic group that I'm studying or sort of like this species that I want to learn about. I'm talking about my family, and I'm talking about my friends, so that definitely has a humanizing fact that I think was important for me in the book, and remains important to me. It also, can make things more difficult, but I think that the God that we worship is a God who necessarily exists in relationship, and so relationships are important to, at some point, rebuilding American Christianity, and having some sort of relationship in place despite all the different things that have happened and the ways that we've hurt one another is going to be important for this country. And I also I saw a really big gap between rhetoric and practice, and I continue to see that.
Can you explain that? Can you flesh that out a little bit? I'd love to hear more about that.
I think, people can post really inflammatory things on social media or say really inflammatory things, but then they wouldn't always carry that out in practice, like they're the first ones who are like, oh, somebody's hurting in our town, let's go help them. Let's go take care of their family. Oh, our nephew is gay. Like, we're going to love him and support him and invite him to the family barbecue.
That is something that I saw. So I spent time in Texas, and it was this very white, conservative, suburban town in Texas. And yes, there were a lot of problems there and a lot of things that I don't agree with. And also some of the most industrious, hardworking, and generous people I've ever known in my entire life. And there is that disconnect where it's like, I think what galls me sometimes is not that I'm like looking, I genuinely, whether it's, family or friends or churches I used to work at, it's not that I genuinely think like, oh, these people are all horrible or these people are all ignorant or whatever. It's more of I don't understand why they don't see the same gap between who they are and what I know they value, and then the political party that they are actively posting things on Facebook about. And it's like, how do we, for those of us, because I do feel a kinship of wanting to be a bridge kind of between different cultures, how do we help deconstruct some of that gap? What does that look like?
Well, and I think one thing I've been thinking about too while you were talking, and you're wondering about like some of the space, like all the things we have in common, but then some of the things that are different for us. And I think maybe one of the things too that plays into how I interpret some of this stuff is that I grew up in the American Lutheran Church, which later became the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And so I currently serve as a pastor in the ELCA. And the ELCA is pretty liberal, like as far as leadership. The people in the pews tend to be pretty 50-50 Democrat, Republican. But the leadership is very liberal, and it's been pretty openly liberal. And so I think sometimes, having been part of groups that can be so dominantly liberal, sometimes that gives you just empathy to see like that there needs to be balance on both
Totally.
sides, and that, the tyranny of a liberal majority is not always a good thing either, and there's a lot of hypocrisy there as well. And so I think that always I always want to like root for the underdog.
Yeah, but that's a beautiful thing. I mean, because I do think, I think about that a lot. I grew up steeped in conservative Republican evangelicalism.
Right.
And there's always a tendency, I think, for any of us, like, and anyone who's watching this, whatever your upbringing is, to the extent that you find it to be problematic, you're going to want to boomerang away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the danger is that you just end up becoming some version of the same problem the other way.
Right.
And I've seen that a lot.
Right.
I would be interested in hearing if you'd be willing to talk about it. Did you get pushback or some frustration from Christian liberals about your book being too kind?
Yeah, absolutely. Like
tell me.
They wanted to read it because they thought I was just gonna like rail on everybody, and I wouldn't. So yeah, and I would say also, like when I was doing a book tour, the majority of my events were in red states. I did a lot of things in North Carolina, a lot of things in Missouri, which is partly Missouri because of family and stuff. But I did something in Naples, Florida. Southwest Florida is very conservative. And so I did, there was not a lot of enthusiasm among people who would call themselves very liberal to engage with the people in my book. And that was a little bit disheartening. And I have a good friend from when I served in California, and got to know her family. And then she is a doctor, serves on the Central Coast of California. And I remember when she started like asking me about my book, she was even like, there was definitely a sentiment of, why do we want to engage with these people at all? Because she didn't have any family or friends who voted for Trump. So it was like, why bother? And I think that, and she's like a wonderful person, she genuinely wanted to know. And that was a good reminder for me too. And I'll say too, so funny thing, you'll resonate with this as a writer. So my book's subtitle, it's Red State Christians, and it's understanding the voters who elected Donald Trump. And that has been like the worst thing because some people read it thinking like, well, she's going to explain to me like, what is wrong with these people? And I really wanted.
Well, it turns out there's a psychological deficiency.
Right.
Like, no, that's not what I'm trying to say at all.
And I really wanted the subtitle to be Meet the Voters, because I genuinely just wanted people to meet one another, especially for people, who haven't met one another on either sides. So that's a lot of times people will like, it seems like a math problem or a science problem. And for me, people are never, that part of it is not as important to me. And I think that was disappointing for people who wanted me to really say, well, this is the formula that made an evangelical Trump voter. And that formula just doesn't quite exist.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true. I do think it's usually a lot more complicated than we want it to make it out to be. And I do think sometimes it's the abortion thing, it's just a non-starter. I do think in 2016, at least, I mean, I've become a lot more jaded in the last couple of years about this because the evangelical support for Trump hasn't changed much, but at least not that I've seen. But I do think there was an element of people saying like, why would I vote? Like all the same reasons not to vote for Trump from their perspective. They saw the same problems either with Hillary Clinton or through her husband.
Totally.
I do think it's complicated. I don't think Biden helps us much with that. I think we still got some of the same problems, but you think so? I mean, for me, it's frustrating because I'm like, well, which person who's problematic with women do we want to choose? But
right. No, I think he helps just in, Hillary Clinton. I think that the left and the Democratic Party really misunderstood and underestimated the extent to which just Hillary Clinton had been built up on right-wing media, Fox News, in churches, in Christian circles, as uniquely awful and
straight up evil.
That's the right word. Yes. In a way that Joe Biden never, ever will be. And partly because he's a white guy, he just can't be seen as that evil.
White guys.
Yeah. So I think that is one constant that I did come up no matter where I went. People really hated Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. And I mean, Trump was appealing to a group of people, I think, that were just over the establishment. I mean, as ridiculous to me as the whole drain swamp thing was and is, and how completely horribly hypocritical it is for our current president to see himself as the non-swamp person, you know, he was playing into a legitimate frustration that I think was real, and
100%.
we're trying to elect one of the most ingrained political people that I had been taught by Rush Limbaugh all throughout the 90s was the devil, kind of.
Right.
I mean, honestly, Hillary, in a way, was always more the devil than Bill.
Right.
Which is probably pretty misogynistic now that I think about it, but...
Right. No, I think Drain the Swamp was very effective because it was true. There is a swamp, you know, and I've... and even if you look at book publishing and how that works, I mean, there's a swamp in book publishing. There's, you know, and all these things, you know, there are very legitimate grievances that people had and have that Trump sort of just gut level tapped into. But then he twisted it and he misdirects the anger that maybe could be directed towards wealthy white Americans and misdirects it to immigrants, to women, to Black people, to gay people. So it's not a new playbook by any means.
It's not.
But it's based on real things that I think Democrats have been. And so when we talk about, one thing I'm interested in your opinion on too, when you talk about abortion, one thing that I think has not been talked about enough is the fact that for some Trump voters, maybe this is more true of like suburban Trump voters or people who tend to find themselves around more Democrats. Abortion's like the safe answer. And I do think there's a huge element of that where it's like socially acceptable to say that it was about abortion when really it was more about a gut level attraction to the kind of America that Trump was talking about.
I think I think that's tricky because this gets into so this is really what you just said is central to the whole reason I wanted to talk to you is like because I suspect the same thing most of the time. But how do I suspect that and not find myself increasingly at odds with a portion of evangelicalism that I wonder sometimes, do you just not like anyone who's different than you? And if that's the case, what does it look like for me as a journalist, as a pastor still, someone who still very much considers himself a pastor? What does it look like for me to participate in all of that without like the prophetic Jeremiah shut up in my bones thing of like screaming like, no, this isn't right? Because like, I'll say this for anyone who's watching and starting to get pretty mad at me at this moment. I do genuinely think, and I've had conversations with many people where abortion genuinely is something that disturbs them to the core of their being and they can't get past it. I've talked with them about how abortion rates decrease quicker under Democratic presidents because they make contraceptive use more available. Doesn't seem to matter that much, which is a little frustrating. But like, I do think that's genuine for a lot of people.
Right.
I do not think, how about this one? I find it interesting that the life a lot of evangelicals are most passionate about protecting is a life that they don't have to interact with.
Yeah, you should write about that. Yeah, Reverend Barber and Jonathan Wilson Hargrove just wrote yesterday a whole piece on the fact that some of the states where coronavirus has been the most destructive and is, you know, rising the most right now are states that have been consistently the most pro-life states. And I think that that's a really important point too. And like what you just said, that, and that goes into the whole thing of how we understand sin and what role sin plays and our understanding of the atonement. I mean, we could really go off in like a theological direction here on why evangelical theology is so problematic to caring about human beings in our midst and caring about poverty.
Yeah, but that's what's frustrating to me is like, and this is where we did grow up differently, but like
Right.
I grew up evangelical. I don't feel like I got to where I'm at now by bailing on the evangelical values I was given. I followed them to their logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Like I actually in the 90s when I was told that character matters and that we as Christians should not vote for a president of bad character or should not actively be out campaigning or supporting because like character and morality matter. I actually believed that.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's sloppy. I know being involved in politics and feeling that way is tough as a Christian. I get that. I don't look at Biden as like our savior from all of that at all. But I like, that's the problem I have is I actually believed that stuff when I was taught it. And now 20 something years later, I'm watching a group of people just bail on all of it. And I'm like, wait, I thought this is what we said we were. It's like up until 2016, I was really committed to trying to make changes from inside the house. And
Hmm.
that was the moment where I think I'm done. I'm not done with Jesus. I'm not done with the Bible. I'm not done with faith. I'm not done in believing that the church can be used for good. But I do not and will not associate with being an evangelical anymore.
Yeah.
Ugh. Anyway, this isn't
You can
about me.
join
I'm just
the
doing you.
you can join the Evangelical Lutheran Church.
Might as well add it to my bingo list. I've already done Southern Baptist, seeker sensitive, Vineyard, Foursquare, and I'm dabbling with a Presbyterian church right now.
Okay, nice.
So I'll just
Nice.
add Lutheran to my list.
Nice.
Oh, you are getting the most. This is like the most honest Josh that you're getting right now, Angela.
That's
Okay,
good.
so one of the things that stood out as I was doing a little bit of research on you, I thought I kind of, I was like, I'm going to read some stuff, watch some interviews. A phrase you keep returning to over and over again is, I wanted to tell the truth. Where did that come from? Why is that such a value of yours that you're like, I want to tell the truth?
I mean, I think in some ways, I was born with it, and I'm just a little bit more politically correct version of my grandfather. My grandpa got kicked out of churches because he was such a, he
Yeah.
didn't mince any words. But at the same time, too, and a lot of people will be surprised to hear this given the ways that we understand American media right now. But that was really a value that was taught to me in journalism school.
Yep.
And I went, old school, the Missouri School of Journalism, University of Missouri, go Tigers, and was really taught that the role of the press was to safeguard democracy and that there was really this role that the media had was to give people access to the truth. So, yeah, that was the reason I became a journalist, and that's it. I loved sports writing and covering the Super Bowl was awesome and all that stuff. But like I went into journalism because I thought it was an opportunity to be in a profession where you could just tell the truth. Now, hearing me say that in 2020, a lot of people are like, that, that's crap. And
You think it is crap?
I think it's becoming tougher. I think that there's still a lot of really great journalists out there doing really important work, and at the same time, I think that journalism with unpaid internships, right? The loss of local news, the centralization of news media in, coastal cities, the proliferation of hiring journalism people for big major American outlets is coming more and more increasingly from Ivy League schools and not from journalism schools like Mizzou.
Yeah.
um, so I think that it's changed. And I was back at Mizzou a few years ago talking to some of my journalism professors, and they were saying that a lot of kids coming out of journalism school now, still their first job, they're making like $25,000 maybe annually.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's in big cities. So you're limiting this profession to people who have families who can subsidize their income for a number of years. Um, or, so I think that I very much believe in and support journalism, but I also do see the ways in which news media is becoming more dominated by American elites and how much difficult it is for a middle class kid to become a journalist. The documentary about Athlete A, I think about the USA Gymnastics scandal, and that story was broken by the main paper, in the Indianapolis Star. And you see when they're filming that newsroom is empty. There's no, people are being furloughed, like, so it does scare me. And I see publishing and journalism continuing to invest in talent that does seem very difficult for people. They may be diverse, more diverse ethnically or racially, or at least still trying to do that. That still needs a lot of work. But how diverse are newsrooms economically? Because I think it's become really difficult to just go move to New York City and work in media. And I do think that's a big problem.
So here's, for anyone who's still watching this and made it through our discussion of the Kansas City Star, which is about as niche of a conversation as you can get, if you're still watching, here's what I want. Like, this is the reason why I thought this interview would be so good, is it's possible to be a Christian of convictions and to be really disgusted with the idolatry of evangelicalism, and to actually probably even have, not to put words in your mouth, but maybe what would be considered more liberal opinions on some stuff. And also to believe that, like, yeah, there's a problem in journalism, and yeah, there's bias, and you know what, liberals being in power and just like, that's not the answer. I mean, to truly follow Jesus really does put you in this middle space. And I mean, I think that's the thing, even though I find myself sometimes getting, like, my personality and the world incline me toward polarization. That's the thing I keep coming back to, is like, when you look at Jesus, he wasn't on anyone's side. He didn't pick a camp. I mean, he was on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, but there was no, like, power system. Everyone, like, the reason I think he got killed was because he refused to pick a team and no one knew what to do with him. And so he was a threat to everyone.
Yeah.
And it's like, we've lost our birthright as the church of being the other kingdom.
And sometimes knowing to, how to, because anytime I start to think too much about this, then I'm like called by, King and the white moderate, and not being the white moderate, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the other thing that was really clear to me in my book is that I think for liberal white Christians, sometimes, like, the most, not that our prophetic words don't matter, but sometimes the most important thing to do too is to pass the mic, because Black and brown Christian movements have been working for justice in this country for a much longer time, and so I think there's sometimes a better tendency is to step off, step down from the top, and to, like, try to share the mic, try to share resources, and try to lift up other voices. So that was something that was, like, the stories of Black and brown Christians in Red State Christians are some of the most powerful stories in that book, and the stories that give me hope for Christianity in America. Which,
again, if you have not already stopped this interview to go buy that book, please do. It's wonderful. You can get it everywhere. So here's a question for you. You've name checked the LGBTQ community a few times in this conversation. I would say, by and large, like, especially when it comes to, like, Twitter or someplace like that, the idea of both being having a certain amount of empathy for Trump voters and being an ally of the LGBTQ community are often seen as being in such opposition that you have to pick one. What has it been like for you trying to hold on to both?
Honestly, I would say that the anti-racism work sometimes is harder, that there's more pushback.
Interesting.
For that sometimes. Because I think that, I don't know.
You think that's because of where you're at right now, like being at the center? Has it always been that way? Or is it because right now you're at the central hub of all of it?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe that has something to do with it being here in Minneapolis. I also, it may also have to do with that in 2009 is when the ELCA voted to extend that people who are gay or lesbian could be pastors in the LCA, and congregations could make individual decisions. And the church I currently serve actually still has on its constitution that a person who's gay or lesbian can't be their pastor, but we're, like, working on changing it and working towards that. But I feel like that is something that's been discussed for a long time. And for me, when that decision first came out, I honestly wasn't there yet. I had to figure it out, and I had to walk through that.
Mm.
So that's something else that makes me feel like I need to have empathy for people who aren't there yet and be able to talk about what difference it made for me. I don't know. I mean, it's it. I haven't gotten a lot of pushback about it, but I also think maybe sometimes that it hasn't been something I've written a whole lot about, to be totally honest with you. I've written a lot more about racism or about sexism.
So I'll give you the grace of let's change to that topic then. How have you balanced the idea of like, to be an anti-racist, you cannot not only not support Trump, but like anyone who voted for him is now the enemy. How have you tried to live in both of those worlds where you're like, no, I'm going to do both?
Yeah, so I'm gone from my church the next 2 Sundays. And so I usually just pray extemporaneously, and I have a list of prayer requests during the service. But because I have someone filling in for me, I had to write out prayers. So I have been praying, a lot after George Floyd and talking about work for justice and work, change coming to the Minneapolis Police Department in particular. And I did have some people in my congregation say, like, well, we need to pray for the police too, and I do have a lot of people in my congregation who are in law enforcement, whether it's a local sheriff or people or state troopers or, people serving in the military. And so I've been pretty conscientious about praying for both and about checking that, that everybody needs to be involved in the fight for racial justice. And, as I say that, I'm really like suspicious of just the quick, like, well, the, police hugging protesters, I don't think we're there yet. But it's too easy to just write people off, I think. And I think that's the biggest thing that like our social media culture has made it really easy to do, is write each other off. So I think we're trying not to do that.
And so underneath all of this red state, blue state stuff, it's really about, like, I hear you modeling just a humility and kindness, like, which is what Jesus looks like. I want to be more like you. I'm dead serious. I know it's going to make you feel weird, but I'm serious. I need to be more like that. I think this is my last question. I reserve the right to come up with one more, but one of the things I try to end every interview with is just, for those people who are watching who are into prayer, what does it look like for us to be praying for you right now?
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. I appreciate that. Well, I've been for a long time trying to figure out what's next for me after Red State Christians as far as book wise. And
So you're saying the sales from that did not set you for life. You're not able just to ride off into the sunset now.
Yeah, right. The movie rights aren't in the works.
Oh, a Red State Christians movie is a great idea.
I know, right? Let's do it. Yeah. So initially I felt really compelled to write about hope in America and how the very places that have been written off as hopeless are often the places where hope is found most prevalently. And so I had a whole kind of plan for that. I had an agent working on that. And then COVID hit and all my research travel, that just wasn't going to be something that happened. So I'm beginning work with a co-author who is a public health expert, and she focuses on rural public health. And so we're working on a book about women in rural America and sort of telling the stories of rural America that don't get told and sort of dispelling the myth of rural America. So I guess just pray for me and for Katie as we, another funny, interesting part of the story is she is a second cousin of mine. So it's also a family story and talking about our family roots in working class, white rural America, and how that has shaped our own journeys in the midst of telling the stories of all these other amazing women.
You're really leaning into that Midwest vibe where everyone's kind of sort of related a little bit. Like, you're really just owning that at your core. I dig that. That's great.
Yeah. By the way, she's my cousin. Yeah. So thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Angela, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to end it. I'm going to stop recording here in a second. Then you and I can keep talking and everyone else can just be curious what we talk about. But thank you so much for your time. If someone wants to follow you, like, what do we need to know about you? Like, tell us everything that if someone's like, I need more Angela in my life, how do they do that?
Follow me on Twitter. It's Angela_Denker. And then I blog once a week on Wednesdays. You can go to angeladenker.com or agoodchristianwoman.blogspot.com. And hope to meet some of you who I connected to through Josh.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much. And Angela, again, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Right. Nope, I just took a snapshot. That's not what I meant to do at all.